There are only two cemeteries in San Francisco. One is at Presidio, which is a military cemetery, and the other one's Mission Dolores. They also have a columbarium where your ashes can be placed, as well as a pet cemetery, but those don't really count. Now, the question is, how does a city of 900,000 people get by with only two cemeteries? And what's even more concerning is that at one point in time, San Francisco had over 27 cemeteries. So what happened to all of those cemeteries, and more importantly, what happened to all the bodies? Now, the thing about cemeteries is that they require a lot of upkeep, and in order to finance and pay for that upkeep, you have to continuously sell plots. That brings the money rolling in, allows you to pay for maintenance and anything else that might need to be done in the cemetery. But due to the fact that there's only so much space in San Francisco, you can only sell so much land, so many plots. And eventually, you run out. And in doing so, you run out of cash flow, and therefore cannot maintain. As maintenance falls, more nefarious activities come into play. People grave rob. They steal the stones and resell them. They conduct rituals outside of the norm. And as San Francisco grew, land became a serious premium. And eventually the decision got made to do something about all of these cemeteries taking up all of that premium land. Additionally, in 1906, there was an earthquake in San Francisco, which resulted in thousands of people dying, and cemeteries began to overflow even more than they were before. And because most religions require burial instead of something like cremation, bodies were essentially piling up. And that meant graves were being used and reused multiple times, which has been happening for a long time, especially in Europe, where land is really at a premium. So the solution was that 14 cemetery associations founded the town of Colma, which I'm standing in right now. And in 1914, an eviction notice was placed on all of the graves in San Francisco, which meant that 155,000 souls at rest had to move and make way for the living. Now, once excavation and transportation began, if a body was claimed by a family member, they had to pay $10 to move the tombstone to the new city of Colma. But seeing as how most of the graves in San Francisco were those of immigrants, loners, miners, just mostly single men that came to strike their fortune in California, they didn't really have a family to speak up for them or pay that $10. Which meant that those bodies ended up in a mass grave and the tombstones were sold as building materials. Now, moving that many bodies means that there's probably going to be shortcuts made, and of course there were. Even today, bodies are being found during excavation for new construction, more recently at the University of San Francisco. And all of that brings us here to Colma, the city of souls, the city of the silent. With a population of 1.5 million, only about 1,500 are actually living, which means that there's a 1,000 to 1 ratio of dead to living here in this city. And in fact, almost everyone who does live here resides in a several block section of town on the northern end, whereas the rest of the space is devoted to 17 cemeteries, as well as a whole bunch of box stores and car dealerships. But it's mostly cemeteries. And these cemeteries are for everyone. There's Serbian, Greek, Jewish, Catholic, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, as well as a pet cemetery. Some of them have over 40,000 graves, and a lot of famous residents, including Wyatt Earp, William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, Levi Strauss, as well as Joe DiMaggio, and even Phineas Gage, who was an oddity in a sense that he had a pole shot through the front of his face and out top of his head, destroyed his frontal lobe, and he continued living for years despite this, although it affected his mood a little bit. And remember that part where I said that if you couldn't pay the $10 during the moving, that your headstone ended up being used and sold for building materials? Well, you can find them scattered around the city. At low tide, you can find them at the aquatic park Breakwater, in the Marina District. You can find them essentially as gutters lining the path of Buena Vista Park. And most recently, they've been used in the wave organ, which goes to show that the saying, "It's great to be alive in Colma," rings pretty true. Thanks for watching. Until next time, get lost.